The book of Exodus tells us that it was 3 months to the day after the Israelites had been freed from their bondage of slavery in Egypt that they came to a desert called Sinai. And as they were in that desert, they came to a mountain. And as they came to that mountain, they made their camp at its base. And not long after they had settled in, the Lord spoke to Moses, commanding Moses to go up the mountain. And once he did, the Lord told Moses that he was to return back to his people with the following instructions. That in 3 days, God was going to appear on that mountain in a thick, dark cloud. And that God was going to speak to the people of God through Moses. But that in preparation for that moment, the people were to prepare themselves, to consecrate themselves, to get ready to hear, to open their hearts and their ears and their minds to what the Lord God would say to them. And so for 3 days, the people prepared for the voice of God to speak. On the 3rd day, a dark cloud descended over the mountain, and it covered the mountain. And inside that cloud there was lightning and fire, and then there was a trumpet that blasted from within the mountain so loud that the mountain itself trembled. And the people, they trembled as well. They approached the mountain, and as they neared the base of the mountain, the Lord called Moses to climb the mountain and to enter into the cloud that was there so that they could be in conversation. And Moses did as the Lord commanded. And God began to speak to Moses, giving Moses commandments as to how the people were being called to live. And over the course of the next 11 months, God would give Moses over 600 commandments, 613 in total, all of which were important, and all of which helped the people of God understand how it was that they were to live as God's people. But the first commandments that were given were special. They were 10 commandments that were lifted above all of the other 603. It didn't mean that they were better or more sacred or that they had to be followed more. They were just elevated. And in their elevation, they gave the people something on which to really focus. Now, there's been a lot of dialogue. Why these 10? Why were these 10 the ones that were inscribed in stone and carried in the Ark of the Covenant? And there's a lot of conversation about why that may or may not have been. But I want to share with you what Adam Hamilton, the person who wrote the book, after which we've named this series. We kind of moved away from the book for the last couple of weeks, but we're coming back to it this week because I really like what Hamilton had to say about this. The reason that he gives for these 10 commandments being named first and kind of having an elevated presence is because he feels like they summarize the other commandments. They cover the other commandments in kind of a broad way. But additionally, they each speak to something that we struggle with either individually or corporately as a people. He says these 10 commandments, perhaps over all others, are commandments that represent where we fall short of the will of God. So what we're going to do over the course of the next 2 weeks is we're going to look at these commandments. And we're going to talk a little bit about how God is speaking to us through them. And the first thing that I want to say about them is I know that these commandments are often seen as, thou shalt not. And I've rarely met the person who loves to be told what he or she can't do. It sometimes comes across the wrong way, and sometimes it feels constrictive and constraining. But these commandments were not given in order that it would reduce our lives or take away our experience of life. They were given so that our lives may be more abundant. They were given as a guidance. They were given to us so that we may learn to live in ways where we would cause ourselves less harm and where we would harm others less. And that's the baseline that we're going to use as we talk about them. You're going to find, I think, in this course of the next couple weeks, that there are commandments you struggle with less, commandments you struggle with more. But if we're honest, I think we can all find a place in each one of these commandments where we have room to grow and room to be more faithful. In the 20th chapter of Exodus, the presentation of the Ten Commandments begins this way. Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. Now, as you may have noticed immediately, there's a lot more words that I've just read than what you typically see inscribed on monuments to the Ten Commandments, or have seen hanging in homes or in office places or wherever you might see them. That's because there's more language to them than what we typically hang on our walls or put on monuments. There's a little more context there. I think it's important for us to look at that context. At the same time, I think that those kind of reduced versions, those condensed versions, do summarize the heart of these commandments. And in this first passage that we've read, there are two commandments, if you ask most Protestants. And the reason that I say that is in different religions, in different traditions, they divide the Ten Commandments up differently. Some of them split the first two, and some of them put them together. Some of them split the last two, and some of them put them together. There's just a little bit difference, a little bit of a difference in the way some traditions mark them and count them. But most Protestants take this first passage and turn it into these two commandments. You shall have no other gods before me, and you shall not make for yourself an idol. And these two commandments were really important given the time and context that the Israelites received them. Remember, they're coming out of Egypt, a place where there wasn't just one God, there were many gods. And people worshiped multiple gods, and they worshiped whatever God they needed to worship in order to get what they wanted or needed. And they didn't just worship those gods, they had statuettes. They would build altars. They would bow down before those gods, and they would worship the symbols and emblems and reminders of those gods. And what God is telling the people at the very beginning is that practice is no more. No more are you to worship any other God but me. No more statues, no more talisman, no more amulets, no more bowing down in worship before these things that are just made out of some earthly element. You are not to worship any of that stuff. You are only to worship me. And that was a big shift from the culture that they had just left. Now, it had always been their culture and their religion to only worship God, but again, they're now able to practice that worship in a way that's free. And the very first thing God says to them, me alone, no idols. Now, we live in a culture where the dominant religions in our country, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, are monotheistic religions. We worship one God. And while we understand and see that God differently, each of us worship this one God. And none of these monotheistic Abrahamic religions tend to center around statuettes or things that we bow down before, a talisman or amulets. We worship God in different ways. We don't bow down before other things. And so we're in a very different place when we hear these commandments. And so how is it that we're supposed to take these ancient commandments that are talking about that and make them make sense in the modern world? Well, the way that I want to talk about that this morning is by asking us some questions. Questions that I've been asking myself this week, and questions that I want to invite you to ask yourself. And I think these questions might help us understand how relevant these first two commandments may actually be in our lives. The first question is this. What is the most important thing in your life? Or what are the most important things in your life? You don't need to answer this out loud. This is my experience of this question. I have asked this question numerous times. I've been asked this question numerous times. And I've heard this question asked numerous times. And almost without exception, when this question is asked, I hear either one of two or these two things: faith and family. Faith and family are the two most dominant answers to this question. In fact, I think in some ways they're just reflexive. And sometimes I wonder if the reason so many people, when asked what are the most important things in your life, they just kind of reflexively say faith and family, is because we think we're supposed to say those things. Like that's the right answer. That's the answer you're looking for, right? Faith and family. I mean, imagine if you came to me and you said, what is the most important thing in your life? And I said, baseball. Absolutely baseball. It's baseball and then everything else. Right? This would not come across well. There are days it's true, but it would not come across well if you asked me what's the most important thing. And that's what I said. The most important thing in my life: faith and family. Right? Let's go a little deeper than that, though. Let's move past the reflexive, right? And let's ask a second level question. Where do you spend most of your time and money? Admittedly, this is a more uncomfortable question. Let's start with time. If you work, especially if you work a full-time job or a full-time job plus, it's a pretty good chance that more days than not, you spend most of your time at work. And that's okay. Just statistically, that's probably where you spend most of your time. But I do want to ask you a question about that. Do you live to work or do you work to live? Because if you live to work, then work may be an idol for you. It may be a god for you. It may be something that's so important to you that you're actually sacrificing not just your family, but sometimes those who live to work, they do sacrifice their family for the sake of work. But we also sacrifice our faith, right? Do you work to live or do you live to work? And that question is an important one when we talk about what are the gods in our lives. Well, let's also talk about how we spend our life outside of work. We have choice about what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. Does the way you spend your time outside of work, the time you're not earning a living, does that reflect your faith or does it reflect something different? How about the money that you spend? Years ago, I'd asked, if you really want to know where your faith is, open up your checkbook. We don't have one of those. All of ours comes on the computer screen. But on the computer screen, I can see everything and everywhere our money goes. I even get little alerts that say, hey, you spent an unusual amount on entertainment this week, right? We're tracking it more closely now than we've ever tracked it. Outside of your mortgage and your transportation and your clothing and your health care and all those things that are kind of essentials, right? We've got those things. Those are real. We've got to spend money on those things. But what's the next level thing? Where's your money going? Because you can say that your faith is the most important thing in your life. You can say that your family is the most important thing in your life. But sometimes where you spend your money tells you a very different story. Where are you using the resources that God has given you? Are they being used to make the world a better place? Are they being used to make the world a better place for you? These are key questions. These are worship questions. These are faith questions. And the way we answer that tells us who our God time, and it's not just about money, it's about where we think. What are the things that you think about most? Maybe you're a worrier. Any worriers? I'm a worrier. Like I'm a professional worrier. Like I've turned worry into an art. And this is what I figured out about worry. Is that when I worry, I'm not just worried about what's happening today. In fact, I'm usually less worried about what's happening today than I am about what could happen tomorrow, or the next day, or 2 weeks from now, or 4 months from now. I borrow trouble because I'm worried about it. And this is what I've learned about worry, is when you're worried about something that may or may not happen, you're not living in the presence. It's hard to worship. It's hard to be connected to God. It's hard to be connected to family and faith when you're distracted by worry. And sometimes what can happen is worry can turn into fear. And fear may not be a God that we worship, but fear can be something that gets in between us and God because we get so focused on it that we can't trust in the grace and the provision of God because we're too worried. What else do you think about? Maybe it's just hobbies. Well, hobbies are great. You should have hobbies. Every one of us should have interests outside of faith and family. But sometimes our hobbies can become obsessions, addictions, things that pull us away from our family and our faith in a way that doesn't enhance our life, but diminishes the rest of our lives. How about politics? Did any of you ever think about politics? Yes, of course you do. Now I'm really meddling. But look, this is important. This is really important. And for me right now, it feels more important now than it has felt for a long time. Our faith should inform our politics. My faith informs how I vote. My faith informs which candidates I support and which policies I support and which policies I do not support. My faith informs that. But what I'm seeing happening too often right now in our political world is that our politics are informing our faith more than our faith is informing our politics. We have become so divisive and so buried and mired in our particular camps and our political ideologies that we're more dedicated to our political ideologies than we are our faith. They've recently done a study and they've discovered that it's easier to change someone's deepest held religious beliefs than it is to change their political beliefs. Let me say that again. It's easier to change someone's religious beliefs than it is their political beliefs. That says something about who our gods are in this culture. And what I'm seeing, and both sides are guilty. And right now, probably people on both sides are going, well, my side's bad, but the other side is worse, because two wrongs make a right? No. Here's the thing, and this is, if we just step back, we're seeing this across the political spectrum. There are behaviors and there are policies coming from all across the political spectrum that do not reflect our faith. It's out there, you see it, and you know it. But here's the thing. If those behaviors or those policies that do not reflect religious faith are coming from our side of the aisle, we're far more accepting of the behavior and we make excuses for it. If it's coming from the other side of the aisle, we make accusations. Right? It is essential for us as a people of faith to make sure that our faith is informing our politics and not the other way around. If you are obsessed with politics right now, which many of you are, and it is important, make sure that that faith voice is what's really getting into that, even if it's challenging you, because it should be challenging. Now here's the thing to remember about all these things. Thinking about these things is not bad. It becomes bad when we begin to think about these things more than we're thinking about God. When we are spending way more of our time thinking about these things than we are about God. Bottom line question is this: what do you worship? And we all kind of know what we worship, right? Is it power? Is it wealth? Is it physical beauty? What is it that you worship, that you crave, that you thirst after? What is it that gets you up and drives you through the day? What is it that defines you? These are questions that we ask because often when we're asked the question, what's important, our reflexive response is God and faith. But as we answer these other questions, we really start to see how there are other gods in our lives. Doesn't mean those things aren't important. They are. They're essential. But what God is saying to us is don't let those things come between me and you. The third commandment. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. We've boiled this down in this way. Thou shalt not use the Lord's name in vain. Which is something that we talk about. We're not supposed to use the Lord's name in vain, for example, when we miss a nail and hit our thumb. Right? That's part of what it's talking about. We're not supposed to use the name of God as an exclamation or a swear word or something like that. Because God's name is sacred. But I think just by boiling it down to don't speak the Lord's name in vain and making it about like language that's profane, we're missing a bigger part of that. Don't use the Lord's name in a wrongful way. Let me give you an extreme example of what I'm talking about. You guys ever seen this group on the news or out and about? This is Westboro Baptist Church. And I had to search the internet to find a picture of them that had signs that was appropriate for all ages, and especially appropriate for worship on Sunday. This is a church church that goes out and their primary goal is to preach hate toward other people. Veterans, victims of crime, gays and lesbians, they go out and they preach hate. They protest funerals, they protest churches, they protest gatherings. This is a group who is using the Lord's name in vain. Because any time you use the Lord's name to proclaim hate over grace and love, you're not speaking on behalf of God. You're distorting that message. And here's a way that I think we need to be aware of it. I'm hoping you guys have never held signs like this. And I would expect that you hadn't. But here's something that we might be more tempted to do. This is what my faith says. This is what the Bible says. This is what I believe. And we start to own things and we start to speak things as though they're God's truth, when really is they may actually be our truths. And when we do that, we may be guilty of misusing God's name. So, for example, I went to undergraduate school and I have a Bachelor of Arts in Religious Studies. Very marketable degree. very marketable. My parents were so happy. So, Bachelor of Arts in Religious Studies. So what I did with that was about the only thing you can do with that. I went to graduate school. And I got a master's degree in theology from an Ivy League university. And you know what I learned in all of those studies? You know what happened throughout all those studies? Is the more I studied Scripture and theology, the more I realized I didn't know. It wasn't that I became a master of theology. What happened was I became a master of my own lack of knowledge and awareness. And that's what happens when we really study faith. We find some truths and we find some things that are certain, but what we also find is, wow, I know a lot less than I thought I knew. When we speak about God, when we speak about faith, when we speak as preachers or disciples, it's so important that we speak with humility. It's so important that we recognize that we may be wrong. And if we don't speak with that humility, we may be guilty of using the Lord's name in vain. And that's something that we really must be careful of doing. The last commandment we're going to cover today is this one. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien residents in your town. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Okay, how many of you take 1 day a week and do absolutely nothing but worship and rest? Me either, right? We talked about this some time ago. We actually did an entire series on the importance of Sabbath. And during that series, we had a challenge as a church. We're going to take 1 day, we're not going to do anything but rest and worship. Now, my family, because you're going to preach something, you kind of have to do it. And so my family, we got together, we agreed to it, and we took Saturday as our Sabbath day because someone works on Sunday. And so we took Saturday as our Sabbath, and we did it. And what we learned a lot of things. One, it was a deep blessing to our family, and it was a real gift. And we were able to keep that Sabbath for longer, to be honest, for longer than I thought we'd be able to keep it. But the other thing that we learned is that keeping Sabbath is really hard. It's really hard. It takes so much work to get ready to take a day when you are doing nothing but resting, recreating, recreating, and worshiping. It's really, really hard. We live in a world that's pretty much 7 days a week now, and we talk a lot about the reason we can't have Sabbath is because we're busier now than generations have ever been. I do not think that is true. I think every generation has been equally busy. I know for a fact my grandparents in the 20s, 30s, and 40s were every bit as busy as we are now, if not even more so. I don't think it's helpful language to say that we're busier now than we ever were. In fact, in some ways, I think it's a little bit offensive. But this I do think is true. I think some of our priorities have shifted. Do you all remember a day when Wednesdays and Sundays, nothing happened other than church? Wednesdays and Sundays. There was no band, there was no drama, there were no student performances, there were no school programs, there was no sports, no games, no practices, none of that. Wednesdays and Sundays, they were off. Then, you remember which day went first? Wednesdays. We started having all that stuff on Wednesdays, and now what's happened to Sundays? Right? The thing here is that it doesn't mean that there aren't other ways to recreate, to recreate, to rest and worship other than coming to church. I'm not scolding you about coming to church and doing all that stuff. There are other ways to do that, but we've shifted our priorities. So much so that 10 years ago, active church attendance was defined as 3 to 4 Sundays a month. Now, 1 to 2. 1 to 2. If you go to church 1 to 2 Sundays a month now, you're considered active. Whereas 10 years ago, you would have been considered inactive. Or 10 years ago, you'd have been considered inactive. That's how much things have changed. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves is, where is our priority when it comes to worship, recreation, and recreation? God commanded it. It is okay for you to rest. It's okay for you to take a break. It's okay for you not to work. And it's not just okay, it is commanded. Friends, we need rest. We need worship. We need connection. This is a commandment of God. And every one of us is breaking this commandment. Every one of us. Now maybe we may not ever be in a place where we can take that full day. But is there not a way we can get better from where we are right now? I think if we can do that, we might just find that the Lord had some wisdom in this commandment. All right, that's enough for today. We're going to put the commandments to rest. For today, we'll come back and touch base with them again next week and work through the rest of them. My hope, though, is as we work through these, they continue to serve as a lens for us. That we have the humility and the faith to be able to say, here's where I'm missing it, here's where I'm getting it right, to build on the strengths that we have, and to grow on the weaknesses. Friends, these things are meant to give us life. And I think if we let them, they will do just that. Amen.